In 1625, a young English colonist named William Blackstone stood on a quiet slope above the Charles River, in a place that would later become Boston, and planted apple seeds in soil that had never seen an English orchard before. Around him was a raw Atlantic settlement world of salt marsh, dense forest, hunger, disease, and uncertainty. Within 5 years, roughly 2,000 English settlers would be living in the Massachusetts Bay region. Within a generation, thousands more would arrive, carrying livestock, iron tools, family Bibles, land claims, and little packets of seeds wrapped carefully against the damp of the crossing. Those seeds mattered. A voyage from England to New England could take 9 or 10 weeks. Food spoiled, water turned foul, people died from fever, malnutrition, and infection in numbers that could make an ocean crossing feel less like migration and more like a slow lottery. And when the survivors reached land, they faced winters that could freeze rivers, summers full of unfamiliar insects, and fields that demanded more labor than many of them had ever imagined. But tucked inside the story of settlement, empire, hunger, and home was something small enough to hold in your palm, an apple, not a pie yet, not even close, just a hard little seed, carrying the genetic memory of a fruit whose true homeland was not England, not America, and not any white farmhouse kitchen with a gingham curtain and a pie cooling on the sill. That is the strange thing about apple pie. Today, you can buy one in a supermarket freezer aisle for a few dollars, wrapped in cardboard, stamped with a flag, and treated as if it has always belonged to America. It sits at picnics, diners, school fundraisers, church suppers, and 4th of July tables. So ordinary that you almost stop seeing it. So how did a dessert made from an Asian fruit, Middle Eastern sugar, Southeast Asian spices, European pastry, and colonial American reinvention become the edible symbol of the United States? How did one sweet slice come to mean comfort, motherhood, patriotism, nostalgia, and home? To answer that, you have to go back much farther than America, much farther than England. The story begins roughly 10,000 years ago, in the mountain forests of Central Asia, especially in what is now southeastern Kazakhstan, near the city of Almaty. And pay attention to that name, because Almaty is often translated as something close to father of apples. That is not a poetic accident, that is a clue. If you walked through the wild apple forests of the Tian Shan Mountains thousands of years ago, you would not see tidy rows of identical trees. You would see chaos, beautiful chaos. Some trees would be tall and tangled, some would bend low under fruit. Some apples would be small, sharp, and bitter. Some would be green, yellow, red, russeted, striped, sour, fragrant, or oddly shaped in ways that would probably horrify a modern supermarket buyer. Some would be barely edible, some would be astonishingly sweet. This was not the apple as a brand. It was the apple as a genetic storm. The wild ancestor at the heart of this story is Malus sieversii, a species that still grows in Central Asia today. Unlike many wild fruits, some of these apples were already large and sweet enough to attract animals. Bears ate them, deer ate them, horses likely ate them, and when animals ate apples, they carried the seeds away in their bodies and left them in new places, wrapped in fertilizer. Not elegant, very effective. Here is the twist. Apples do not grow true from seed. If you plant a seed from a sweet red apple, you do not get the same sweet red apple. You get a genetic gamble. The new tree may produce fruit that is sour, tiny, bitter, dry, or wonderful. Every apple seed is basically a roll of the dice. Think about that for a second. A wheat seed grows wheat much like its parent. A grape cutting can preserve the vine, but an apple seed is a surprise. That means the first humans who gathered wild apples were not simply discovering one fruit. They were discovering variation, selection, patience, and disappointment. They did not know the word genetics. They were doing it anyway, long before anyone baked an apple pie. People in Central Asia were watching trees. They learned which fruit ripened early, which kept longest, which made you pucker, which made you come back for more. They learned that some apples could be stored into winter, and in a world without refrigeration, that was not a luxury. It was the difference between sweetness in the cold months and nothing at all. Storage, that one detail changes everything. Fresh fruit is beautiful, but fresh fruit is temporary. A fruit that can be kept, dried, fermented, traded, pressed, packed, or carried becomes something else. It becomes food security. It becomes medicine. It becomes a gift. It becomes value in the ancient world. A fruit that could survive beyond its season was a quiet technology. Now, apples also entered myth very early. Though you have to be careful here. People often talk about the apple in the Garden of Eden, but the Hebrew text of Genesis does not actually name an apple, it names fruit. The apple became attached to the story later, partly through European art, language, and theology in Latin. The word malum could mean both apple and evil, depending on context, which is the kind of linguistic accident that can steer centuries of painting and preaching. So no, Eve was not definitely holding an apple, but the fact that later Europeans imagined the forbidden fruit as an apple tells you something. By the Middle Ages, the apple had become familiar enough, symbolic enough, and morally flexible enough to carry a whole world of meaning, temptation, knowledge, beauty, danger, sweetness with consequences. And that symbolic weight did not come from nowhere. Across ancient Eurasia, apples travelled slowly, not as one perfect fruit, but as seeds, seedlings, cuttings, stories, and habits. They moved along routes that would later be called the Silk Roads, passing through the hands of herders, traders, farmers, soldiers, and migrants. The apple's journey was not one grand expedition. It was 1,000 small movements, a tree planted near a camp, a seed dropped beside a road, a cutting carried to a village, a sweeter fruit noticed, remembered, protected. But there was a problem. If seeds produced unpredictable apples, how could people preserve the best ones? The answer was grafting. Grafting is one of those ancient techniques that looks almost magical the first time you understand it. You take a piece of a tree you like, a twig from a good apple, and join it to the rooted base of another tree. If the union takes, the branch grows, and the fruit remains the same as the parent tree, not similar, the same variety, a living copy. This was not just gardening, it was cloning, done with knives, hands, and patience. Nobody knows the first person who grafted an apple tree. Their name is gone, but the invention changed fruit history. Once grafting spread, people could preserve sweetness, texture, colour, and keeping quality across generations. The apple could become less gamble and more promise. It still needed help. Apples required seasons, they needed chill, sunlight, pollination, pruning, and time. A tree did not feed you tomorrow. It asked you to believe in a future several years away. Planting an apple tree was an act of faith. Planting an orchard was a statement that you intended to stay. That is why apples have always been more than food. They are tied to settlement, to inheritance, to patience, to the idea that someone might stand in one place long enough for a seedling to become shade. From the forests of Kazakhstan, the apple moved westward into Persia, the Caucasus, Anatolia, and the Mediterranean world. Along the way, it met farmers who already understood vines, olives, figs, pomegranates, and grain. These were people who knew how to turn landscapes into systems, irrigation, terraces, storage pits, walled gardens. They looked at fruit trees and saw not only beauty, but order. And here is where the apple begins its transformation from wild mountain fruit into cultivated treasure. In ancient Persia, gardens became symbols of paradise. The very English word paradise traces back through Greek and Old Persian roots connected to enclosed parks or gardens. These were not just pretty places. They were controlled worlds, full of shade, water, fragrance, and power. To plant fruit trees in dry lands was to display command over nature. It said you had water, you had labour. You had permanence. An apple in that setting was not a lunchbox snack. It was proof that humans could take a wild sweetness from mountain forests and make it obey a garden wall. That sounds simple now. It was not, because every apple pie that would ever be baked depended on that long chain of human attention. Someone had to notice the tree. Someone had to carry the seed. Someone had to protect the sapling. Someone had to learn grafting. Someone had to build orchards. Someone had to believe that fruit was worth waiting for. No Central Asian forest, no apple, no grafting, no reliable sweetness. No orchard culture, no pie. This is where the story quietly becomes global, before America could claim apple pie, before England could bake it, before Rome could spread it. The apple had already crossed mountains, languages, and centuries. It had already been shaped by bears, traders, gardeners, and unnamed farmers whose work survives every time you bite into crisp flesh and call it ordinary. And that is the first irony in the history of apple pie. The most American dessert begins as one of the least American ingredients imaginable, a wild fruit from the mountains of Central Asia, tamed by ancient hands, carried west by roots older than nations, and preserved by a technique so clever it allowed humans to copy sweetness from one living branch to another, not America, not pie, an apple. And the next people to turn that apple into a continental obsession were waiting farther west, building roads, armies, villas, kitchens, orchards, and an empire that knew exactly what to do with a useful tree. By the time the apple reached the Mediterranean world, it had already become something more controlled, more useful, and more desirable than the wild fruit of the Central Asian mountains. It had passed through Persia, Anatolia, Greece, and the older orchard cultures of the Near East, gathering techniques as it moved. People had learned to graft it. People had learned to prune it. People had learned to store it through winter, dry it, press it, stew it, and turn it into something that could outlast the brief perfection of harvest. Then Rome found it, and Rome, as Rome often did, turned a useful thing into a system. You have to picture the Roman world not only as marble temples, senators in white togas, and legions marching beneath eagle standards. Picture roads, picture farms, picture estates stretching across hillsides, picture storehouses, markets, bakeries, kitchens, taverns, army camps, and ships packed with oil, wine, grain, fish sauce, and fruit. Rome was not just an empire of conquest. It was an empire of logistics. That matters, because apples reward logistics. They are not like figs, soft and fragile. They are not like olives, which need pressing before they become useful as oil. They are not like grapes, which collapse quickly unless dried or fermented. Apples can travel better than many fruits. They can be packed in straw. They can sit in cellars. They can feed soldiers, servants, children, and landowners. They can become vinegar, cider, medicine, sauce, or dessert. In a world without refrigerators, this was not cute. It was practical. Roman writers noticed. The agricultural author Columella, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, described grafting, orchard management, and the careful treatment of fruit trees. Pliny the Elder, whose natural history tried to gather almost everything an educated Roman could know about the world, listed many apple varieties known in his time. The exact numbers vary depending on translation and classification, but the point is clear. Rome did not see the apple as a single fruit. Rome saw types, qualities, purposes, and names. Some apples were better for eating fresh, some were better for storing, some were prized for scent, some were known for colour, some were sharp, some were sweet, some were elite, some were common. This was not wild gathering, this was selection. And here is the detail that explains a great deal about what happens later. The Romans did not merely grow fruit, they spread fruit culture. When Roman roads pushed across Gaul, Hispania, Britain, and the Rhine frontier, they carried soldiers, law, taxes, pottery, coins, Latin words, and plants. Orchards followed empire. Vines followed empire. Gardens followed empire. The apple travelled not as a wandering accident, but as part of a broad agricultural package. It was food, but it was also civilization as Rome understood it. Think about that for a second. To plant an orchard in a conquered province was not just to make dessert possible. It was to impose rhythm, seasons, property lines, pruning, harvest, storage. It meant a landscape was being folded into Roman habits. A tree could be political, quietly, without ever appearing on a battlefield. Now, this does not mean Roman Britain suddenly became a land of apple pies. It did not. The pie, in its later form, still needed medieval pastry, cheapened sugar, changing tastes, and centuries of domestic cooking. But Rome helped create the conditions. It brought orchard knowledge into places where apples would later become deeply embedded, including Britain, and Britain matters. Because America's apple pie story passes through England before it crosses the Atlantic. When Roman influence reached Britain after the invasion under Emperor Claudius in the year 43, the island already had wild crab apples, small, tart, useful in their own way. But cultivated apples and Roman orchard practices expanded what was possible. Villas in Roman Britain often included gardens and agricultural estates. And although the surviving evidence is fragmentary, the broader Roman pattern is unmistakable. Fruit trees were part of the package. Rome also brought something else that pie would eventually need. Pastry. Not apple pie as you know it. Not buttery, flaky crust curling at the edge of a ceramic dish. Roman pastry was different. Roman cooks used flour, oil, cheese, honey, eggs, nuts, fruit, and spices in ways that could feel familiar for 1 second, and then deeply strange the next. A Roman sweet dish might include honey, pepper, wine, dates, and herbs in combinations that would surprise a modern diner. If you ordered some of these flavors at a cafe today, you might assume someone had confused dessert with salad dressing. But the Roman kitchen understood enclosed foods. It understood doughs. It understood baked mixtures. It understood the usefulness of wrapping, sealing, thickening, and carrying food in grain-based forms. The path to pie is not a straight line, but the ingredients of the idea were already gathering: flour, fat, fruit, heat, and then there was sweetness, before refined sugar became widely available in Europe. Honey was the great sweetener of the ancient Mediterranean. Honey had status, flavor, and sacred associations. Bees turned flowers into gold, and humans treated that transformation with appropriate amazement. Roman cooks used honey generously, including with fruit. Apples could be cooked with honey, wine, and spices, creating dishes that were not apple pie, but were clearly ancestors of sweetened apple desserts. Here is the twist. The Roman apple world was sophisticated, but it was not democratic. Good fruit took land. Land required ownership. Orchards required labor. Grafted trees required skill. A beautiful dessert on a Roman table carried with it the invisible work of slaves, tenants, gardeners, transporters, millers, bakers, and cooks. That is one of the recurring patterns in this story. Sweetness looks innocent at the table. It often is not innocent in the field. For now, the darker machinery is quieter than it will become in the age of Atlantic sugar. But it is still there. Roman agriculture depended heavily on enslaved labor, especially on large estates. The villa kitchen did not float above society. It was built from it. When a wealthy Roman enjoyed fruit preserved in honey, or a carefully cultivated apple from an estate orchard, the taste was connected to hierarchy, not just flavor, power. After Rome's Western Empire began to fracture in the 5th century, its orchard world did not simply vanish. That is important. Empires collapse faster than trees. A road can break. A tax system can fail. A legion can disappear from a frontier. But an apple tree keeps standing in a field, producing fruit every autumn if someone does not cut it down. Monasteries, local estates, village farmers, and surviving regional traditions kept orchard knowledge alive. Some Roman varieties disappeared. Some techniques were forgotten in one place and preserved in another. But the apple remained. It was too useful not to remain. It fed people in autumn. It stored into winter. It could be dried. It could be fermented. It could be cooked into thick, comforting food when fresh grain was scarce and the cold pressed against wooden shutters. And here is where the apple begins edging closer to pie. The Roman world had spread orchards. The post-Roman world preserved them. The medieval world would put them inside pastry. But before that happened, Europe had to become a place of ovens, enclosed crusts, feast days, spice routes, church calendars, household labor, and kitchens thick with smoke. The apple was ready, the pastry was waiting, the sugar was still expensive, and somewhere in medieval England. Cooks were about to put these pieces together in a form that finally begins to look familiar. Not modern, not American, but recognizably, unmistakably pie. The medieval English kitchen was not the charming cottage scene people like to imagine when they picture apple pie. It was darker, hotter, smokier, and far more practical. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp wool, boiling broth, old rushes on the floor, and whatever was being baked, roasted, salted, dried, or saved from spoiling before it could be eaten. Ovens were precious. Fuel mattered. Labour mattered. Nothing about food was casual. This is the world where apple pie begins to take recognizable shape, not as a symbol of America, not as a slice with vanilla ice cream, not as a golden dessert sitting under a perfect lattice crust, as survival, status, storage, and feast food. In medieval England, pies were often called pies, and the crust was sometimes known as a coffin. That sounds grim, because it is. But it did not originally mean a funeral box in the modern emotional sense. It meant a container, a case, a sturdy shell made from flour and water, sometimes with fat, designed to hold filling while it baked. The crust could be tough, thick, and not especially pleasant to eat. In some cases, it was more packaging than pastry. Think of it less like the buttery crust you know and more like edible cookware. This was not about delicate dessert. It was about containment. A pie crust could seal in juices. It could protect meat or fruit from ash and smoke. It could help preserve food a little longer. It could make a dish portable. It could turn scraps, spices, fruit, fat, and leftovers into something ordered and impressive. In a world where cooking vessels were valuable and many people owned very little, that mattered. The earliest English apple pies we can point to in written form come from the late medieval period. A famous recipe appears in a cookbook often known as the Form of Curie, compiled around 1390 by cooks connected to the royal court of King Richard II. The recipe is not quite what you would expect. It includes apples, figs, raisins, pears, and saffron, all enclosed in pastry, no sugar. That detail feels strange now, because modern apple pie is built around sweetness, but in late medieval England, refined sugar was expensive, imported, and still closer to medicine or luxury than everyday pantry staple. If a cook wanted sweetness, they used fruit itself, dried fruit especially, or honey when available. Raisins and figs were not random additions, they were concentrated sweetness, chewy texture, and trade routes in miniature. This was apple pie before apple pie became simple. Some were soft, some were spiced, some were coloured with saffron, some were filled with fruit mixtures that modern people might call overcomplicated, but the logic was clear. Apples alone could be sharp, especially older varieties. Pears added softness, figs added density, raisins added sugar without sugar, saffron added colour, aroma, and money. Because saffron was not humble. Saffron came from the dried stigmas of crocus flowers, and it required enormous labour to produce, even today. It remains one of the most expensive spices in the world by weight. In a medieval pie, saffron was not just flavour, it was a signal. It said the household could afford beauty. It said this was not plain boiled pottage. This was a dish meant to impress. Here is the irony. The thing that would later become a symbol of plain American wholesomeness began, in writing at least, as courtly food touched by imported luxuries, not simple, expensive. And this is where you have to understand medieval taste. Medieval elite cooking loved mixtures of sweet and savoury, fruit and meat, spice and fat, softness and crunch. The line between dinner and dessert was not as rigid as it is today. Apples could appear with meat. Spices could appear in almost anything. A pie could be grand, strange, fragrant, and dramatic. Cinnamon, ginger, cloves, mace, nutmeg, pepper, saffron. These were not casual flavourings, they were prestige. They came through long chains of merchants, ports, ships, caravans, wars, taxes, and monopolies. By the time a little spice reached an English kitchen, it had crossed much of the known world, and that means even the earliest apple pie was already global. The apple had come from Central Asia. The pastry had been shaped by European grain culture. The figs and raisins spoke of Mediterranean trade. The saffron glowed with the labour of distant fields. These spices came from farther still. This was not a local dessert, it only looked local because it was baked in a local oven. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains the future of apple pie. Medieval England loved apples, but it did not love them in only one way. Apples were eaten fresh, cooked, dried, pressed into cider, used in sauces, and mixed into dishes that could stretch expensive ingredients. They belonged to orchards, monasteries, manor houses, village plots, and markets. They were familiar enough to be everyday, but flexible enough to become festive. That is a powerful combination. A food that is too rare cannot become national. A food that is too ordinary may be ignored. But a food that moves between common life and celebration can gather meaning. Apples could do that. Pie could do that. Together. They would become dangerous in the symbolic sense, capable of carrying memory. Still, in the medieval period, most people were not eating apple pie the way you might imagine. Many ordinary households had limited access to fine flour, costly spices, and ovens. In some villages, bread and pies were baked in communal ovens or in the ovens of wealthier households. Cooking was shaped by class at every level. A noble table might display elaborate pies with decorated crusts. A poorer table might rely on pottage, coarse bread, ale, cheese, onions, peas, and whatever fruit could be gathered or grown. Apple pie existed. It did not yet belong to everyone, but it was moving in that direction as the later Middle Ages gave way to the early modern period. Printed cookbooks began to spread recipes more widely among literate households. Sugar slowly became more available, though still expensive for a long time. Butter and refined pastry techniques improved. Household ovens became more common among those who could afford them. The crust began its long transformation from container to pleasure. That sounds minor, it was not. Once the crust itself became something people wanted to eat. Pie changed. It was no longer just a shell protecting filling. It became a complete food. Texture mattered. Flake mattered. Browning mattered. The edge of the pie, once practical, became part of the attraction. And apples were perfect for it. They softened when baked, released fragrance, balanced acidity with sweetness, and accepted spices beautifully. Cinnamon made them warmer, nutmeg made them deeper, butter made them richer. Sugar, when it arrived in greater quantities, made them feel comforting in a way that would later become almost emotional. Here is the part that tends to get hidden under nostalgia. Apple pie was never just apples. It was always a meeting place, between orchard and oven, between wealth and want, between local harvest and distant empire, between the hunger of winter and the performance of abundance. A medieval person seeing a pie come out of the oven would not think of baseball, 4th of July fireworks, or American flags. Of course not. They would think of heat, skill, feast, preservation, household management, and maybe, if the filling was especially fragrant, the astonishing reach of trade, not patriotism, dinner. But the form was now alive. a crust around apples, a dish that could travel from court kitchens toward ordinary homes, a food that could absorb sugar, spices, butter, memory, and meaning as the centuries passed. The apple had found pastry. Now pastry was waiting for empire. Once apples had entered pastry, the story could have remained small. It could have stayed in orchards, kitchens, market towns, and household recipe books, a comforting European dish shaped by season and skill. But apple pie did not stay small, because the ingredients around it were not small. They came from ships, plantations, wars, monopolies, and oceans. This is where the dessert begins to widen. At first glance, an apple pie seems local. You can imagine the tree behind the house, the flour from a nearby mill, the butter from a dairy cow, the hands of a cook dusted in white. But that picture is incomplete. By the early modern period, the pie's flavour increasingly depended on things that could not be grown in England at all. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, sugar, not apples, not wheat, not butter. The things that made apple pie taste warm, rich, festive, and familiar were often the least local ingredients in the entire dish. Think about that for a second. The flavour you may think of as cosy and domestic was built on global distance. The scent that makes a kitchen feel safe came from trade systems that were anything but safe. Cinnamon reached Europe through ancient and medieval trade routes from South and Southeast Asia, especially from Sri Lanka and nearby regions, for centuries. European buyers often had little direct knowledge of where it came from. Spices moved through layers of middlemen, across the Indian Ocean, through Arab, Persian, Venetian, and other commercial networks, and finally into European markets at prices that reflected distance, danger, scarcity, and secrecy. Nutmeg and mace were even more extreme. They came from the Banda Islands, a tiny cluster in present-day Indonesia. Tiny, but historically enormous. For a long time, this was the only place in the world where nutmeg grew naturally. Imagine that. One small island group controlled the source of a spice that European elites wanted for kitchens, medicines, perfumes, and displays of wealth. That is not a charming food story. That is a geopolitical fact with blood on it. By the 16th and 17th centuries, European powers were desperate to bypass old spice routes and control supply directly. Portuguese ships entered the Indian Ocean. Dutch merchants followed. English traders watched, competed, copied, and fought. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, became one of the most powerful corporations the world had ever seen, with the ability to wage war, build forts, sign treaties, mint coins, and govern territory. A company with armies, and at the centre of part of that struggle was nutmeg, the warm, sweet spice that later ends up grated into desserts, puddings, custards, and apple pies. If that sounds absurd, it should. People crossed oceans, seized islands, and killed for the flavour that now sits in a little jar in the back of a kitchen cabinet, usually next to cinnamon and baking powder. The Banda Islands suffered terribly. In 1621, under Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, Dutch forces carried out a brutal campaign to impose monopoly control. Thousands of Bandanese people were killed, displaced, enslaved, or forced into labour systems designed to serve spice production. The exact numbers vary in surviving accounts, but the destruction of Bandanese society was catastrophic. Catastrophic. Here is the uncomfortable point. Nutmeg in European food did not simply come from clever trade. It came from coercion. It came from monopoly. It came from violence organized around aroma. Apple pie did not cause the Banda massacre. Of course, that would be ridiculous. But the flavors that made European pies richer belong to the same world of extraction. The kitchen and the empire were not separate. They were connected by price, appetite, and ships. And then there was sugar. This is the ingredient that changed everything for much of medieval Europe. Sugar was rare and expensive. It was treated partly as spice, partly as medicine, partly as luxury. It appeared in elite households, apothecaries, and courtly dishes. Not in everyday cups of tea or ordinary pies, but as European colonial expansion intensified, sugar production moved into Atlantic islands and then the Caribbean and the Americas on a horrifying scale. Madeira, São Tomé, Barbados, Jamaica, Saint-Domingue. Those names are not just places on a map. They were landscapes transformed into engines of sweetness. Sugar cane is labor-hungry. It must be planted, cut, crushed, boiled, clarified, and processed quickly after harvest. The boiling houses were blisteringly hot. The cut cane was sharp. The fields were exhausting. The mills could maim workers in seconds. The smell was a mix of green cane, smoke, sweat, molasses, and fear. And the labour system that made sugar cheap was slavery, not assisted by slavery, not merely associated with slavery, driven by slavery. By the 18th century, hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans were forced to work on Caribbean sugar plantations under conditions so brutal that death rates were often staggering. On some islands, plantation owners relied on constant new importation because enslaved populations were worked to death faster than they could naturally grow. That is the part that should make you stop. Sugar became cheaper in Europe because human beings were made disposable. So when sugar entered apple pie more generously, it did so through a world of suffering. A once rare luxury became increasingly available to ordinary households because ships carried enslaved people one way, plantation crops another way, and profit back to European ports, Liverpool, Bristol, London, Nantes, Amsterdam. The sweetness of the pie was not innocent. Now, the English recipe tradition kept evolving by the 17th century. Apple pie recipes began to look closer to what you would recognize. Apples were sliced or quartered. Sugar appeared more regularly where families could afford it. Spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, mace, and cloves were added according to taste and status. Butter enriched the filling. Double crusts became more desirable. The crust was no longer only a container. It was becoming part of the pleasure. This was not yet American pie. It was English pie in a global age, and it was already carrying contradictions. The apple itself could be local and seasonal. The wheat could be local. The butter could be local. But the sweetness and spice carried oceans inside them. Here is the strange intimacy of food history. You can stand in one kitchen, smell one pie, and be connected to a forest in Kazakhstan, a Roman orchard, a medieval English oven, a cinnamon grove in Sri Lanka, a nutmeg island in Indonesia, and a sugar plantation in Barbados, all of it invisible, all of it folded into the crust. That is why everyday foods can be so powerful. They hide the map. They make empire smell like home. Of course, no English cook rolling pastry in the 17th century would necessarily think in those terms. She might be thinking about fuel, guests, household accounts, the sharpness of the apples, whether the crust would hold, whether there was enough sugar, whether the pie would please a husband, a master, a family, or a table of visitors. She was doing kitchen work, not writing global history, but global history was there anyway, in the jar, in the spoon, in the price. The more sugar Europe consumed, the more plantations expanded, the more spices Europe demanded, the harder empires fought to control islands and routes, the more ordinary sweetened pies became, the more people forgot that sweetness had once meant distance, danger, and luxury. That forgetting matters. Because when apple pie eventually crossed the Atlantic and became wrapped in the language of simplicity, virtue, and national innocence, it carried all of this with it. The dessert that would one day be called as American as apple pie was already made from migration, conquest, trade, exploitation, and desire. Not just apples, not just pie. A whole world disguised as dessert. And across the Atlantic, English settlers were about to enter a continent where apples would become something else again. Not just a fruit for pies, a tool of settlement, a source of alcohol, a marker of land claims, a promise that a European home could be planted in American soil. When apples crossed the Atlantic, they did not arrive as a symbol, they arrived as cargo. Seeds in pockets, cuttings wrapped in damp cloth, young trees packed as carefully as living things could be, packed on wooden ships that pitched for weeks across cold, violent water. They travelled with English, Dutch, French, and other European colonists who carried not only tools and livestock, but assumptions about land, assumptions about farming, assumptions about what counted as civilization, assumptions about which foods made a place feel like home. The Atlantic crossing was hard on everything alive. Plants dried out, roots rotted, salt air damaged leaves. Rats ate stores, water soured. People became ill in the cramped space between decks, where the smell of bilge water, vomit, smoke, tar, and unwashed bodies could turn a voyage into a floating fever ward. Some seedlings survived, many did not. That mattered because European settlers did not arrive in an empty world. This is the first thing to understand. North America was not a blank wilderness waiting politely for orchards. Indigenous nations had shaped, burned, farmed, hunted, planted, traded, and managed landscapes for thousands of years. They grew maize, beans, squash, sunflowers, tobacco, and many regional crops. They gathered berries, nuts, roots, wild plums, pawpaws, persimmons, and crab apples. They knew seasonal abundance with a precision newcomers often failed to recognize. The English looked at forests and often saw waste. That was not a neutral mistake. To many indigenous people, the landscape was full of food, medicine, history, and lore. To many Europeans, land became most legitimate when fenced, ploughed, planted with familiar crops, grazed by familiar animals, and written into familiar property systems. An orchard was not just an orchard, it was a claim. It said, someone intends to stay here. Someone has imposed a future on this ground. The apple fit perfectly into that mindset. But the apples Europeans brought were not automatically good-eating apples. Remember the problem from the beginning of the story. Apples do not come true from seed. Plant one seed, and you get a surprise. Plant a whole sack of seeds, and you get a small universe of genetic uncertainty. Some trees produce fruit so sour it puckers the mouth. Some make apples better suited for pressing than eating. Some bear small hard fruit that modern shoppers would ignore without mercy. And here is the key. Colonial Americans did not need every apple to be sweet enough for dessert. They needed cider. Hard cider was one of the great early uses of colonial apples. In many settlements, water could be unsafe. Milk spoiled quickly, and imported drink was expensive. Fermented cider was useful, familiar, and comparatively stable. It could be consumed by adults, and in weaker forms by children. It could be stored. It could be traded. It could turn a difficult harvest into drinkable calories. So before apple pie became the American icon, the apple was often an alcoholic workhorse. Not dessert, drink. That detail changes the whole picture. The first colonial orchards were not planted primarily for fragrant pies cooling beside a window. Many were planted for cider, vinegar, animal feed, and household utility. A sharp, tannic, strange apple might be terrible in your hand, but excellent in a cider barrel. The orchard did not have to produce beauty. It had to produce use. In the early colonies, apples also brought emotional comfort. English settlers were far from the villages, hedgerows, parish churches, markets, and orchards they had known. Planting familiar trees helped convert terrifying distance into something bearable. A sapling could stand for memory. A row of trees could soften homesickness. In a place where so much felt uncertain, an apple blossom looked like continuity. You can almost see it. A rough wooden house, a patch of cleared ground, smoke from a chimney, stump still standing at the edge of a field. A few thin apple trees protected from animals, the family waiting years for fruit. Not weeks, years. Planting an orchard meant patience. It also meant possession. Colonial governments sometimes encouraged orchard planting, directly or indirectly, because fruit trees signalled improvement. In some areas, land laws and settlement expectations rewarded visible cultivation. Orchards became evidence that land had been occupied, altered, and claimed according to European legal imagination. The trees grew slowly, but the message was immediate. This land is being made ours. Here is where the story becomes uncomfortable again, because the phrase made ours hides a great deal. European settlement expanded through treaties made under pressure. Violence, disease, warfare, fraud, and displacement. Indigenous communities suffered catastrophic population losses after European contact. In some regions from epidemics that moved faster than settlers themselves, smallpox, measles, influenza, and other diseases devastated societies with no prior immunity. Entire networks of diplomacy, trade, agriculture, and kinship were shattered. The orchard did not cause those epidemics, but orchards grew inside the world those losses made possible for settlers. That matters. The apple tree, so gentle in appearance, could become part of a colonial landscape that replaced indigenous land use with European ownership. Fence, field, orchard, deed, road, town, order, to one people, dispossession to another, and the settlers often misunderstood the abundance around them. Some praised indigenous foods when hunger forced them to learn. Others dismissed native farming as primitive, even while depending on maize, beans, and local knowledge to survive. In the early years of English settlement, maize saved lives repeatedly. Apples did not. You could not plant a seed in spring and eat apples in autumn. Trees took time, corn was immediate. So why did settlers keep planting apples? Because apples were future food, because apples became drink, because apples marked permanence, because apples tasted like somewhere else. Because the colonists were not only trying to survive America, they were trying to remake it. This was not just agriculture, it was memory with roots. Meanwhile, different European groups brought different food habits. Dutch settlers in New Netherland planted orchards and maintained garden traditions around the Hudson River. French colonists in Canada and the Mississippi Valley developed their own fruit and cider practices where climate allowed. English colonists spread apple culture through New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and later the interior. Regional varieties began emerging, many from chance seedlings that someone noticed and preserved. Some were crisp, some were aromatic, some stored well, some made excellent cider, some were winter apples, capable of lasting through the cold months when fresh food was limited and diets became heavy with salted meat, grain, roots, and preserved goods. In that world, an apple in January could feel like a small miracle, not because it was exotic, because it was still there, and slowly. The apple began to belong to colonial life. It was pressed, dried, stewed, baked, fed to animals, boiled into apple butter, turned into vinegar, and tucked into pies when flour, fat, sweetener, and time allowed. Apple pie existed in America from European traditions, but it was not yet the national emblem. It was one food among many in a difficult colonial kitchen. Still, the ingredients were aligning. The English pie tradition had arrived. The orchards were taking root. The settlers were developing local apple varieties. Sugar, though still unevenly available, was becoming more common through Atlantic trade. Spices came through ports, ovens improved, household recipes traveled between women, families, taverns, and handwritten books. The pie was becoming American before anyone called it that, but not because it was invented in America. That is the central irony. America did not create apple pie from nothing. America inherited a European form, filled it with a Central Asian fruit, sweetened it through Atlantic commerce, spiced it through Asian trade, and baked it in a colonial world built on native dispossession and settler ambition. Then, over time, the memory of all that complexity began to fade. People remembered the orchard, they remembered the kitchen, they remembered the smell. They forgot the crossing, the claim, the cider barrel, the violence beneath the field, and from that forgetting, one of the most powerful food myths in American history began to grow. By the time the apple took root in colonial America, it had become one of the most useful plants a settler could own. Not the prettiest, not always the sweetest, not even something you necessarily wanted to bite into fresh from the tree. Useful, that is the word to hold on to. A colonial orchard was not a romantic backdrop. It was a working machine made of living wood. It gave fruit for the table, peelings for pigs, vinegar for preservation, cider for drinking, dried slices for winter, apple butter for storage, and sometimes a small surplus to sell or trade. It turned land into calories. It turned autumn into barrels. It turned patience into a kind of wealth. And in much of early America, the apple's most important form was not pie, it was cider. Hard cider sat at the center of everyday life in ways that can feel surprising now. Because modern Americans tend to treat cider as seasonal, rustic, and optional. Something served cold at autumn festivals or warm with cinnamon in a paper cup. In the colonial world, Cider was practical, ordinary, and everywhere apples could grow well. A family might press barrels of it after harvest. A tavern might serve it constantly. Farm labourers might drink it during work. Children might drink weaker versions. Ministers drank it, politicians drank it, nearly everyone drank it. This was not the cocktail hour version of alcohol. This was hydration, calories, comfort, and habit. Water was not always dangerous, but it was not always trusted either, especially in crowded settlements or near livestock, wells, and waste. Milk spoiled. Tea and coffee required imported goods. Beer required grain that might be needed for bread. Cider, by contrast, could be made from apples that were otherwise too sour, too bitter, too bruised, or too strange for the table. A beautiful eating apple was nice. A reliable cider apple was economic security. Think about that for a second. The apple that helped build early America was often not the perfect red fruit in a lunchbox. It was gnarled, sharp, tannic, and unpleasant in the mouth. But crush it, ferment it, barrel it, and wait. And suddenly it became one of the most important drinks in a settler household. Transformation, that is what apples offered. Colonial records, farm diaries, and later accounts show how deeply cider entered American life. In New England and the Mid-Atlantic, orchards became a standard feature of farms where climate permitted. Families planted seedling orchards, then selected the trees that performed best. Because seedlings were unpredictable, every orchard could become a little laboratory. Most trees were not famous. Most varieties were never named. They simply did their work and disappeared, but some stood out. A farmer noticed a tree with fruit that kept unusually long. A neighbour admired a cider with better flavour. A family grafted a branch. A local variety spread from one farm to the next, not through corporate branding or scientific breeding programs, but through memory, gossip, taste, and cut wood. This was folk horticulture. No glossy label, no supermarket sticker, just someone saying, "That tree is worth saving. Here is the part that does not get enough credit." The diversity of early American apples was enormous because the system encouraged genetic accident. Seedling orchards created endless variation. Some apples were green and hard. Some were yellow and sweet. Some were streaked with red. Some ripened in summer and vanished quickly. Some stayed firm for months. Some were excellent for cider. Some were better for sauce, some were best for livestock, which sounds insulting until you remember that feeding animals through the year was part of survival. A modern grocery store may give you a neat wall of familiar names: Honeycrisp, Gala, Fuji, Granny Smith. Colonial America had thousands of local apples, many of them known only in a county, a valley, or even a single farm family's memory. Some were famous for a while, some were loved and then lost, some probably tasted terrible, and that was fine. Because colonial apples did not need to satisfy a national market, they needed to satisfy local need. That made them far more varied than the polished apples you see today. A supermarket wants uniformity, a farm family wanted function. The cider economy also shaped land. An orchard took years before it fully produced, so planting one showed commitment. It said a household had enough confidence, or enough desperation, to imagine itself remaining on that land long enough for the trees to bear. The orchard stood between present hardship and future stability. That future mattered on the frontier, where cleared land, fences, and productive trees could support claims of improvement in a society expanding westward. Improvement was not an innocent word. It meant European-style cultivation. It meant turning forest, meadow, and indigenous land into property recognizable to colonial and later American law. Apple trees helped translate land into ownership. An orchard could say what a document said. This is mine. You have to understand the force of that. A tree that looks peaceful can still participate in conquest. Apples gave settlers food and drink. Yes, but they also helped make settlement durable. They rooted families into places where other people already had histories, hunting grounds, farms, sacred sites, and political relationships. Cider America was never just about cider. It was about belonging. And who was allowed to belong? Inside the household, apples entered daily labor in autumn. Families gathered fruit into baskets and carts. They sorted the good from the bruised, the keepers from the press apples, the drying apples from the animals' share. The smell would have been sharp and sweet, with crushed skins, damp leaves, earth, and the first cold in the air. Pressing cider was physical work. Apples were ground or crushed, packed into cloth or straw, then pressed until juice ran out in cloudy streams. Then came waiting. Fermentation made the apple last. Fresh juice could spoil, but cider could travel through the year. It could become stronger, sharper, or rougher depending on the apples, the barrel, the temperature, and time. It could turn to vinegar, which was not failure if you needed vinegar for pickling, preserving, cleaning, and cooking. A good orchard did not produce one product. It produced options of survival. And slowly, around this practical apple world, the pie kept developing. When a household had flour, fat, apples, sweetener, and an oven, pie made sense. It used fruit that stored well. It could feed several people. It could be served at meals, gatherings, taverns, or holidays. It could be plain or rich depending on the household. It could be made with molasses, maple sugar, refined sugar, or dried fruit when sugar was scarce. But in early America, apple pie was still not yet the grand national symbol. It was too ordinary for that. It was simply part of a broader apple culture that included cider, vinegar, sauce, butter, dumplings, dried rings, and preserves. The pie was one branch of the tree, not the whole tree. That is what makes the later transformation so interesting. Before apple pie could symbolize America, the apple itself had to become American in practice. It had to spread across farms. It had to enter taverns. It had to fill barrels. It had to become part of land claims, work rhythms, autumn rituals, and household economies. It had to stop feeling foreign, not because it was native, because it was planted everywhere. By the 18th century, apples had become deeply woven into colonial life from New England through the middle colonies and beyond. A farm without an orchard could feel incomplete. A harvest without cider could feel thin. A cellar without stored apples could feel vulnerable. The fruit from Central Asia had become one of the anchors of European life in North America. But the apple that spread so powerfully across this new landscape was still unstable, still varied, still wild round the edges. It needed people who could carry it farther, people willing to plant seeds by the thousands, people who saw orchards not only as food, but as opportunity. And soon, one of those people would become a legend, barefoot in the memory of school children, tin pot on his head in the paintings, gentle, wandering, eccentric, and far more complicated than the myth allows. Johnny Appleseed was coming. Johnny Appleseed enters American memory almost like a bedtime story inside the larger bedtime story. You can picture him the way generations of children were taught to picture him. Bare feet, ragged clothes, a sack of seeds over one shoulder, a tin pot for a hat, a gentle wanderer moving through the frontier, tossing apple seeds wherever he went, feeding birds, befriending wolves, and leaving orchards behind like blessings. It is a beautiful image. It is also incomplete. His real name was John Chapman, and he was born in Leominster, Massachusetts in 1774, just as the American Revolution was beginning to tear Britain's mainland colonies away from empire. His mother died when he was still young. His father had served in the Revolutionary War. Chapman grew up in a new nation that was restless, expanding, violent, hopeful, unstable, and hungry for land. That matters. Because Johnny Appleseed was not simply wandering through a peaceful wilderness planting trees for the joy of it. He was moving through the machinery of American expansion. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, settlers were pushing westward into Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. This was not empty land. It was the homeland of native nations, including the Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, Wyandot, Potawatomi, and many others, each with their own political systems, villages, trade networks, sacred places, and memories to the United States. However, the region increasingly appeared as opportunity. Surveyors mapped it, speculators bought claims, treaties were pressured, broken, or imposed. Armies fought to open territory, families followed, and along that frontier walked John Chapman. Here is the useful correction. Chapman was not mostly planting sweet-eating apples for pies. He was planting seedling nurseries, often from seeds collected from cider mills. Those seeds would produce unpredictable apples, and many of them would have been best for cider. Sharp cider, hard cider, the drink of early America. So the myth gives you dessert. The reality gives you alcohol, land, religion, and business. Chapman's method was clever. He moved ahead of dense settlement, found promising land near rivers and trails, planted nurseries, fenced them when he could, and arranged for neighbors or local families to care for them. Later, when settlers arrived, he could sell young trees. Sometimes he sold cheaply, sometimes he traded, sometimes he accepted old clothes, food, or simple kindness. He was generous, by many accounts, but he was not clueless. He understood that apple trees had value in a moving frontier world. This was not random seed scattering. It was a nursery network. And the distinction matters. A planted nursery helped incoming settlers establish orchards faster. Orchards helped farms look improved. Improvement helped land claims. Land claims supported settlement. Settlement hardened conquest into daily life. Apple trees made expansion feel domestic. That is one of the strangest powers of the apple in America. It could soften the image of frontier violence. A cabin, a well, a barn, and an orchard look peaceful in a painting. They look like family. They look like work. They look like home. But they often stood on land from which native communities had been pushed through disease, debt, war, fraud, hunger, treaty pressure, and military force. A seedling could be innocent in one hand and part of dispossession in another. Both things can be true. Chapman himself was also more unusual than the cartoon version suggests. He followed the teachings of the Church of the New Jerusalem, often called Swedenborgianism, after the Swedish religious thinker Emanuel Swedenborg. Chapman carried religious writings with him and reportedly shared them as he travelled. He believed deeply in spiritual realities, kindness to living creatures, and a form of simple life that seemed strange even to many frontier settlers, who were not exactly known for delicate manners. Stories about him multiplied. Some said he slept outdoors in hollow logs, some said he refused to harm animals, some said he put out his campfire rather than injure mosquitoes. Some said he warned settlers of danger during conflict. Some remembered him as barefoot in winter. Others saw him as eccentric, dirty, gentle, shrewd, holy, foolish, or some mixture of all of those. The cleanest version is almost certainly too clean. But the reason the stories survived is revealing. America wanted Johnny Appleseed. It wanted a gentle founder for the orchard frontier. It wanted a saint of seeds. It wanted a man who could make westward expansion look kind, natural, and inevitable. Not conquest, planting. That is a much easier story to tell children. And yet, do not flatten him too much in the other direction. Chapman appears to have been genuinely compassionate. He seems to have lived with unusual simplicity. He walked vast distances, he planted real trees, he helped spread apple culture across parts of the old Northwest. He left nurseries behind that settlers used. He was not merely a symbol invented after the fact. He was real. That is what makes him so powerful. The myth did not have to create him from nothing. It only had to sand away the inconvenient edges. No cider economy, no land speculation, no federal expansion, no native dispossession, no religious eccentricity that would be difficult to fit into a schoolroom mural, just the smiling man with the seed bag. Here is a detail worth lingering on. The apples Chapman planted from seed were genetically unpredictable, which means his nurseries helped preserve the wild diversity of American apples. They were not standardized. They were not branded. They were not bred for supermarket shelves. Every seedling might become something new. Most would be ordinary, some would be bad, a few might be excellent. That frontier apple world was messy, local, and alive. Some apples were good for pressing. Some were good for drying. Some survived brutal winters. Some ripened early enough to matter. Some kept in cellars when snow cut roads off from markets. Some were probably so sour they seemed designed less for eating than for teaching humility. Still, they had uses. Cider remained central, and so did vinegar. Applejack, a stronger drink made by freeze concentration, also became part of the rural alcohol world. Farmers could leave fermented cider outside in freezing weather, remove the ice, and concentrate the alcohol in what remained. Simple chemistry, very cold chemistry. Also a good reminder that early Americans were not waiting around politely for dessert. The apple was becoming part of American identity through work before it became part of American identity through nostalgia. Chapman died in 1845 near Fort Wayne, Indiana. Though even details around his final days vary in retelling. By then, the United States had transformed dramatically. The Revolution was history. The frontier had moved. Canals, roads, land offices, militias, churches, taverns, and farms had remade huge stretches of the continent. Orchards had spread with them. Within decades, Johnny Appleseed would become folklore. Children's books softened him. Newspapers romanticized him. Public memory turned him into a kind of American folk saint. The Disney version in the 20th century would make him even gentler, even more musical, even easier to love. And by then, apple pie was already on its way to becoming a symbol of home, mother, nation, and innocence. That is the pattern. First the tree spreads, then the story sweetens. Then the violence becomes background, then the dessert becomes pure. But history does not work that way. The apple on the frontier was never pure. It was practical, fermented, profitable, symbolic, generous, and entangled with expansion. John Chapman was not a simple mascot. He was a real man moving through a complicated country, planting seeds that grew into nurseries, orchards, cider barrels, land claims, memories, and myths. And once the young United States had orchards, homes, cookbooks, and a growing sense of itself as something separate from Europe, apple pie was ready for its next transformation. It was about to enter the Republic, not just as food, as virtue. By the time the United States became a republic, apple pie had already been in American kitchens for generations. It did not arrive suddenly with a flag in one hand and a copy of the Constitution in the other. Food rarely works that neatly. It was there in handwritten receipt books, in taverns, in farmhouses, in town homes, in seasonal meals, in the practical rhythm of women who had to turn stored apples, flour, fat, fire, and whatever sweetener they had into something filling. But after the Revolution, the meaning around the pie began to change. The new United States needed symbols. That sounds abstract, but it was urgent. A country made from 13 former colonies had to teach itself to feel like one nation. It needed stories, rituals, heroes, songs, landscapes, household habits, and shared tastes. It needed ways for people in Massachusetts, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas to imagine that they belonged to the same experiment. Politics could not do all of that. Food helped. Think about the problem. The new republic had defeated Britain, but it had inherited British law, British language, British Protestant traditions, British fashions, British architecture, British recipes, and British anxieties about class. Americans wanted to be distinct, but they were still deeply entangled with the culture they had rebelled against. Apple pie itself was not invented in America. The basic form was English, the apple was Asian, the spices were global, the sugar was Atlantic, the wheat and butter were old world staples. And yet, in American kitchens, the pie began to feel different, not because the ingredients changed completely, because the setting changed. In a republic suspicious of aristocracy, domestic food took on moral weight. The ordinary household became political in a quiet way. A well-run home suggested virtue, discipline, thrift, order, and independence. Women, who were largely excluded from formal politics, were often described as guardians of republican character, responsible for raising citizens and managing households that reflected the values of the new nation. This idea is often called Republican motherhood, but the lived reality was not a tidy slogan. It was labour, endless labour. Cooking, washing, spinning, mending, nursing, teaching, preserving. Apple pie fit into that world because it could represent competence. A good pie meant the cook understood the season, the oven, the dough, the apples, the family stores, and the expectations of the table. It was not just sweetness, it was management. Here is the part modern nostalgia tends to flatten. When people later imagined apple pie as motherly, they were drawing from a real history of women's domestic labour. But they were also sentimentalizing it. They turned work into warmth. They turned skill into instinct. They turned exhaustion into love. That is a very old trick. An early American woman did not simply make a pie. She might have rendered lard, churned butter, dried apples, kept yeast alive for bread, managed a hearth, guarded flour from pests, stretched sugar, fed children, fed hired men, served guests, and cleaned up afterward without applause. The smell of baking apples may have been comforting, but the work behind it was physical and relentless. Not a mood, a job. Cookbooks helped shape this domestic world. In 1796, Amelia Simmons published American Cookery, widely recognized as the first known cookbook written by an American and published in the United States. Its full title called it Work Adapted to This Country and All Grades of Life, which tells you exactly what was happening. American cooking was beginning to describe itself as American, even when it drew heavily from British traditions. Simmons included recipes for pies, puddings, cakes, preserves, and practical household foods, using ingredients common in the new nation, including cornmeal, pumpkin, cranberries, and local produce. This was not a declaration of culinary independence all at once. It was more like an accent forming. American cookery began to sound like itself. Apple pie appears in that larger pattern. It was familiar enough to be unthreatening, flexible enough to adapt, and common enough to travel across regions. It could be made plain for family or enriched for company. It could use fresh apples in season, dried apples in winter, molasses or sugar depending on means, and spices when available. It belonged to the practical kitchen, but it could also stand on a table with pride, and the table mattered. In the early republic, taverns, inns, and public houses were not only places to drink, they were places where politics, business, gossip, travel, and food met. Men discussed elections, land, debts, wars, sermons, roads, and prices over cider, ale, meat, bread, and pies. A pie could sit in a public room as plainly as a newspaper. Part of the material culture of conversation. You did not need a national anthem playing in the background for food to help create national feeling. The Republic was being eaten into existence one meal at a time. That may sound too poetic, but consider the scale. Most people encountered the nation not through grand speeches, but through taxes, roads, mail, newspapers, markets, churches, militias, schools, and household routines. A shared food did not erase regional differences, but it gave people a common language. Apple pie became one of those foods that could move between farm and town, north and south, rich and modest tables, women's work and men's memory. It carried a useful vagueness. That is why symbols work. They do not have to mean only one thing. Apple pie could mean thrift to one person, abundance to another, hospitality to a guest, skill to a cook, comfort to a child, and respectability to a household. It could be ordinary and special at the same time. Here is another layer. Apples themselves also fit the New Republic's self-image. They suggested cultivation without decadence, improvement without aristocratic luxury, permanence without old European castles. An orchard looked morally acceptable. It was productive. It was rooted. It improved land. It rewarded patience. It did not look like court excess, even when the larger story behind the ingredients included empire and slavery. That contrast mattered. The new nation liked to imagine itself as plain, virtuous, agricultural, and free. Apple pie could sit comfortably inside that imagination. It seemed rural, it seemed wholesome, it seemed democratic. A dessert with aristocratic European ancestors began dressing itself in homespun, and nobody had to say it out loud yet. The phrase as American as apple pie had not fully arrived. That would come later, after wars, newspapers, advertising, and mass culture did their work. But the emotional foundation was being laid in this period. Apples were everywhere. Pies were familiar. Domestic ideology gave them moral glow. National identity gave them a new frame. Slowly, almost quietly, apple pie was becoming less English in American memory. Not because anyone erased the recipe overnight, because people stopped caring where it came from. That forgetting was useful. Nations often adopt things by forgetting their origins. They take borrowed foods, borrowed words, borrowed customs, and treat them as ancient inheritance. Over time, repetition becomes authenticity. Your grandmother made it. Her mother made it. A local church served it. A soldier remembered it. A town fair rewarded it. Eventually, nobody asks whether the first version came from somewhere else. It feels native because it has been loved locally. That is powerful. It is also misleading by the early 19th century. Apple pie had gathered several of the meanings it would later wear proudly. It meant household order. It meant rural abundance. It meant women's labor disguised as affection. It meant seasonal continuity. It meant the Republic as something ordinary people could taste. But history was not finished sweetening the slice before apple pie could become America's cleanest symbol. You have to look at what that cleanliness concealed. The Republic that praised domestic virtue also depended on slavery. The households that served sweet pies were tied to sugar markets. The orchards that marked improvement were tied to native dispossession. The kitchens that created comfort often relied on people whose labour was ignored or coerced. The pie was warming on the table. The dark orchard was waiting behind it. Behind the warm image of apple pie, there is another history. It is not gentle. It does not smell like cinnamon in a farmhouse kitchen. It smells like sweat, smoke, molasses, wet earth, iron, blood, and exhaustion. This is the dark orchard, not because apple trees themselves were uniquely cruel, but because the dessert that would later symbolize American innocence depended on systems that were anything but innocent. You cannot honestly tell the history of apple pie without talking about land taken from indigenous peoples, kitchens worked by enslaved people, sugar produced through plantation violence, and the way sweetness helped hide brutality under the language of comfort. So pause here. The pie on the table looks simple: apples, crust, sugar, spice, maybe butter. But each of those ingredients can become a door. Open the apple door, and you find settler orchards spreading across native homelands. Open the sugar door, and you find Caribbean plantations and the forced labor of enslaved Africans. Open the kitchen door, and you find women's work, servants' work, and in many places enslaved work, turned into hospitality for people who did not do the labor themselves. This was not just dessert, it was an edible summary of power. Start with land. European and then American expansion did not merely add orchards to a landscape. It replaced older relationships to land with new ones backed by law, debt, force, and military power. Indigenous nations had their own forms of agriculture, stewardship, diplomacy, and territorial belonging. They were not waiting for European improvement. That word, improvement, sounds harmless. It was not harmless. It often meant fencing land, clearing trees, planting European crops, grazing livestock, building permanent houses, and proving to colonial or American authorities that land had been made productive in a way they recognized. An orchard was useful evidence. A planted apple tree said permanence. A row of trees said settlement. A producing orchard said that the future had been claimed. To settlers, this looked like progress. To the people being displaced, it could look like erasure taking root season by season. The violence was not always a single dramatic battle. Sometimes it was a treaty signed under pressure. Sometimes it was a debt trap. Sometimes it was a boundary moved. Sometimes it was a hunting ground cut off by fences. Sometimes it was livestock destroying crops. Sometimes it was a road, then a tavern, then a mill, then a town, then a court that no longer recognized the world that had existed there before. Slow violence, still violence, and then there was sugar. This is the part that should make you angry. Because sugar did not merely accompany slavery in the Atlantic world. Sugar helped drive slavery. Cane plantations demanded extreme labor, fast processing, huge capital investment, and brutal discipline. Enslaved Africans and their descendants were forced into fields under tropical heat, cutting cane with blades, hauling it to mills, feeding rollers that could crush limbs, and working in boiling houses where the air was thick with steam, smoke, and the sickly sweet smell of reducing cane juice. The sugar that sweetened European and American foods became cheaper because enslaved people paid the real cost with their bodies. The numbers are difficult to hold. Over 12 million Africans were forced onto slave ships during the transatlantic slave trade. About 10 million survived the Middle Passage and reached the Americas. Millions more died in raids, marches, coastal prisons, ship holds, fields, mills, and plantation hospitals that were often hospitals in name only, in the Caribbean sugar world. Death rates were so high in many places that planters repeatedly imported more enslaved people rather than allow families and communities to flourish. Read that again in plain language. The system consumed people. It did not accidentally harm them, it consumed them. By the 18th century, sugar had moved from rare luxury toward everyday desire in Britain and its colonies. Tea with sugar, preserves with sugar, cakes with sugar, pies with sugar. A sweet tooth that looked personal was also political, economic, and colonial. Ports grew rich. Merchants insured ships. Refiners processed raw sugar. Shopkeepers sold it in loaves and cones. Households shaved it, crushed it, stirred it, baked it, and increasingly forgot the fields. Forgetting was part of the comfort. If you are eating pie in a tidy room, you do not want to imagine the cane knife. You do not want to imagine the auction block. You do not want to imagine a child separated from a mother so that sweetness can become cheaper by the pound. But history requires you to imagine it. Apple pie in America was also shaped by enslaved labor directly. In the plantation South, enslaved cooks produced elaborate meals for white households, including pies, puddings, preserves, breads, cakes, and sauces. Some were extraordinarily skilled. They understood hearth temperatures by sight and touch. They managed yeast, pastry, meat, vegetables, pickling, drying, and seasoning without modern measures or appliances. They cooked under surveillance, under threat, and often for people who claimed ownership over their bodies. When guests praised his table, the enslaver received honor, The cook often received nothing that resembled freedom. That is a terrible exchange, and it happened daily. You also have to look at gender and class. In northern and southern households alike, domestic cooking was framed as women's natural duty, but the work was never evenly distributed. Wealthier women could supervise servants, hired help, apprentices, or enslaved workers. Poorer women did the labor themselves, often while caring for children, tending animals, preserving food, washing clothes, and contributing to farm production. The sentimental image of pie as pure love hides the fact that love was expected to express itself through exhaustion, not instinct, labor. Apple pie gathered warmth from kitchens where many people had very little power. Enslaved cooks, indentured servants, hired girls, farm wives, daughters, widows, poor women taking in baking or boarding work. Their hands made the foods that later became national symbols, but the symbol rarely made room for them. And here is the bitterest contradiction. As the United States built an identity around liberty, domestic virtue, and honest agricultural abundance, it was also expanding slavery, seizing native land, and deepening racial hierarchy. The same nation that could praise the humble orchard could force indigenous peoples from ancestral homelands. The same household that could celebrate a sweet pie could buy sugar produced by enslaved labor. The same republic that imagined itself morally exceptional could depend on people it refused to recognize as fully human. This was not hypocrisy around the edges, it was structural. Apple pie did not create that structure. A dessert does not command armies, write slave codes, or negotiate dispossession. But food participates in the world that produces it. It carries that world quietly. It makes violence domestic. It turns distant exploitation into something fragrant enough to serve after dinner. That is why this chapter matters. Without it, the history becomes too clean. It becomes a postcard, a farmhouse, a smiling mother, a perfect crust, a nation without victims. Real history is not that tidy. Real history asks who planted the trees, who lost the land, who cut the cane, who milled the flour, who hauled the wood, who tended the fire, who rolled the dough, who served the table, and who was allowed to sit down and eat without fear. Those questions do not ruin apple pie. They make it honest. Because the story of American apple pie is not only the story of comfort, it is the story of how comfort is made, who gets to enjoy it, and who is made invisible so that others can call it simple. And after all of that, after land, labor, sugar, smoke, and silence, another transformation was coming. Machines would enter the kitchen, railroads would shrink distance, factories would cheapen flour and sugar, stoves would regulate heat, advertising would polish memory. The pie would leave the hearth and enter the age of industry. The 19th century did something strange to apple pie. It made the pie feel older by making it newer. That sounds backwards, but stay with it. The pie that later Americans remembered as timeless was shaped profoundly by machines. Factories, railroads, printed advertisements, standardized ingredients, and kitchen technologies that earlier cooks would have regarded with astonishment. What felt like grandmother's recipe was often also the product of industrial flour, cheaper sugar, commercial shortening, metal stoves, canned apples, mass-market cookbooks, and a food economy moving faster every decade. The old pie did not disappear, it was rebuilt. Begin with flour. For most of human history, flour was local, uneven, and labor-intensive. Grain had to be grown, harvested, threshed, milled, sifted, stored, and protected from damp, insects, mice, and spoilage. A fine white flour was not the casual pantry staple it later became. It required milling skill, good grain, and processing. In the United States, the rise of more efficient mills, especially in the 19th century, changed what households could expect. By the late 19th century, roller milling and large flour operations helped produce finer, more consistent white flour at scale. That mattered for pie crust. Pie crust is not forgiving when ingredients behave unpredictably. Coarse flour, uneven fat, uncertain ovens, and household chaos can still produce food. But consistency is difficult. Industrial milling moved pie from a skill shaped entirely by local conditions towards something more repeatable. Not easy. Exactly. Anyone who has ruined a crust knows better, but more predictable. Then came sugar in larger quantities. As sugar production expanded through slavery, colonial plantations, beet sugar, industrial refining, and global trade, sweetness became increasingly available to ordinary households. By the 19th century, sugar was no longer only a medicine, spice, or luxury in many American homes. It became expected. Preserves became sweeter. Cakes became more common. Pies became more indulgent. A pie with barely sweetened apples is one thing. A pie with a proper measure of refined sugar is another. It tastes more like memory, even before the memory exists. Then came the stove. This is easy to underestimate because modern kitchens hide the drama. You set a temperature, you wait. A little light tells you what the oven is doing. In earlier hearth cooking, heat was alive, unstable, and demanding. Cooks judged temperature by experience, by the color of coals, by the placement of pots, by the feel of radiant heat against the skin. Baking required attention and skill. Too hot, and the crust burned before the filling softened; too cool, and the pastry sagged and toughened. The spread of cast-iron cook stoves in the 19th century changed domestic cooking. Stoves did not remove labour. They often added new forms of cleaning, fuel management, and household expectation, but they enclosed fire, controlled heat more effectively, and made baking more manageable in many homes. A pie could be planned with greater confidence. A household could bake more regularly. Recipes could assume an oven that behaved somewhat like other ovens. That last part is crucial. Standard recipes need standardized tools. Printed cookbooks expanded at the same time. In the 18th century, many recipes were still called receipts, and they often assumed that the cook already knew a great deal. A line might say to bake until done, which is helpful only if you already know what done looks like. By the 19th century, cookbooks, women's magazines, domestic manuals, and newspaper columns increasingly taught technique, ingredients, measurements, and household ideals to a growing reading public. This was not just instruction, it was culture formation. A woman in Ohio, a woman in Massachusetts, and a woman in Missouri could read similar guidance about pastry, table setting, thrift, elegance, and respectable domestic life. Their kitchens were not identical, but their expectations were being linked. Apple pie could now travel not only by family memory, but by print. And print gave pie authority. When a recipe appeared in a cookbook, it looked stable, it looked correct. It looked as if apple pie had one proper form, or at least a family of proper forms: fresh apples or dried apples, sugar or molasses, cinnamon, nutmeg, lemon, butter, maybe cream, a top crust, a bottom crust, sometimes lattice, sometimes deep dish. Regional differences persisted, but mass print made the dish feel nationally legible. At the same time, transportation transformed the apple itself. Canals, steamboats, and railroads connected farms to cities. Apples could move farther and faster. Flour could move farther. Sugar could move farther. Spices could move farther. A pie in an urban boarding house or hotel might contain ingredients gathered from an increasingly continental marketplace. The railroad was not sentimental. It was steel logistics, smoke, schedules, freight rates, and bruised fruit packed in barrels. But it helped turn local harvests into national supply. Apples from productive regions could reach distant markets. Urban consumers could buy fruit that did not grow nearby. Seasonal rhythms did not vanish, but they were stretched. Canning added another layer in the early 19th century. The French inventor Nicolas Appert developed a method of preserving food in sealed containers through heat, and later commercial canning expanded across Europe and the United States. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, canned fruit became increasingly common. Apples could be peeled, sliced, cooked, packed, shipped, stored, and opened months later. A pie no longer had to begin with an orchard, a cellar, or a basket. It could begin with a can. That may feel like a loss, and in some ways it was. Canned fruit could flatten texture and flavor, but it also changed labor and access. It made baking possible when fresh apples were unavailable, when storage failed, when time was short, or when urban life separated household from orchards. Industrial food often narrows flavor, but it also widens convenience. Both things are true. Then came manufactured fats. Lard and butter had long been central to pastry, but industrial shortening changed pie crust in the 20th century. Products like Crisco, introduced in 1911 by Procter & Gamble, offered a shelf-stable, plant-based fat marketed as modern, clean, economical, and reliable. Advertising did not merely sell fat, it sold confidence. A cook who feared pastry could be told that the right product would make success manageable. The message was simple: buy this, and tradition becomes easier. That was the genius of industrial food marketing. It presented new products as guardians of old values. A factory-made shortening could promise old-fashioned pie. A printed label could promise motherly care. A packaged ingredient could promise homemade authenticity, which is a strange phrase when you really think about it. Homemade, brought to you by industry by the early 20th century. Companies understood the emotional power of apple pie and used it. Flour brands printed recipes. Sugar companies encouraged baking. Stove manufacturers promoted reliable ovens. Later, refrigerator companies, canned goods companies, and frozen food brands would all borrow the glow of domestic tradition. They did not create apple pie's meaning from nothing. They refined it, packaged it, repeated it, and sold it back to Americans. This was not the death of homemade pie. People still baked from scratch. Families still had recipes. Churches, diners, fairs, and farm kitchens kept local traditions alive. But the meaning of homemade was changing in a marketplace full of branded ingredients. A pie could be made at home from factory flour, factory sugar, factory shortening, canned filling, and a recipe from an advertisement. Was it homemade in one sense? Yes. A real person made it in a real kitchen. In another sense, the pie had become a collaboration between household labour and industrial capitalism. No one put that on the recipe card. Yet industrialization made apple pie more widely available, more consistent, and more emotionally powerful. It could appear in diners, cafeterias, hotels, lunchrooms, and railway restaurants. It could be sliced and sold. It could travel with soldiers, workers, migrants, and schoolchildren as a memory of home even when home itself was changing. The pie was no longer only a seasonal farm dish. It was becoming a national product, a reproducible comfort. And once something becomes reproducible, it can become symbolic on a much larger scale. Newspapers can mention it. Advertisers can decorate with it. Soldiers can miss it. Politicians can praise it. Immigrants can learn it. Diners can serve it under glass domes beside coffee that never stops refilling. Apple pie was ready for its next role. Not just food for the household. Food for the nation at war, at work, and at the counter, by the time the United States entered the age of mass war. Apple pie had already become familiar enough to be emotionally useful. That is an important distinction. A symbol does not need to be invented from nothing. It needs to be waiting in enough kitchens, memory, newspapers, lunch counters, and family stories that someone can point to it and say, you know what this means? Apple pie was waiting. During the Civil War, soldiers on both sides wrote constantly about food. They wrote about hunger, boredom, coffee, beans, salt pork, hardtack, stolen chickens, packages from home, and the impossible distance between military rations and remembered meals. Hardtack was so dry and so infested at times that men joked bitterly about it, though the joke probably became less funny once you were the one trying to eat it. Camp food could be monotonous, smoky, greasy, undercooked, overcooked, or simply absent. A pie from home could feel like another world. You have to imagine the contrast. A soldier sitting in mud, smelling damp wool, horse manure, gunpowder residue, wood smoke, and unwashed bodies, then receiving a box from his family. Inside might be socks, letters, preserves, cake, or pie packed as well as anyone could manage. It might arrive crushed. It might arrive stale. It might not arrive at all. But the idea of it mattered almost as much as the food. That pie was not just calories. It was proof that someone still remembered him as more than a body in uniform. After the Civil War, apple pie moved deeper into public American life. County fairs rewarded pies, church suppers served them, hotels and boarding houses offered them, diners, once they developed into a recognizable form, put pies under glass domes where customers could see them waiting. The pie became visual shorthand. You did not need to read a menu carefully if there was a tall, browned pie sitting near the coffee urn. The message was already there, home, for sale by the slice. This was not cynical in every case. Many pies were made by real cooks with real skill. But commercial food learned early how to borrow domestic emotion. A lunch counter could serve a slice of apple pie to a travelling salesman, a railway worker, a clerk, a widow, a student, or a factory hand. and for a few minutes the customer could feel connected to an idealized kitchen that might never have existed quite as remembered. Memory is not a photograph. It is a recipe that keeps changing. The late 19th and early 20th centuries gave apple pie more platforms. Newspapers printed recipes and jokes. Magazines linked pie to household competence. Agricultural fairs turned baking into competition, and competition into local pride. A good pie could represent a farm wife's skill, a community's abundance, or a region's apple crop. Apples appeared in school lessons, children's stories, advertising images, and patriotic rural scenes. Bit by bit, the pie became less a specific food than a sign. Then came the First World War. American soldiers sent overseas carried with them an intense hunger for home, and food became one of the easiest ways to describe what they missed. They missed coffee the way they knew it. They missed white bread, familiar meat, family cooking, and pie. Apple pie appeared in songs, letters, jokes, and service culture as part of the emotional vocabulary of American home life. By the early 20th century, it was already understood well enough that invoking it required little explanation. When you said apple pie, people heard mother, kitchen, safety, and the country left behind. Not policy, not territory. Home. That emotional pattern intensified during the Second World War. Soldiers were asked why they were fighting, and the famous answer, sometimes phrased as fighting for mom and apple pie, became part of American wartime mythology. The exact origins of every version are hard to pin down, because phrases like this often spread through repetition rather than a single clean birth certificate. But the meaning was unmistakable. Apple pie had become part of the language of moral purpose. A soldier was not just fighting against fascism in the abstract. He was fighting for a world where the kitchen still existed. For the mother at the oven, for the town diner, for the holiday table, for the ordinary sweetness of a country that imagined itself worth defending. Pause on that, because it explains how powerful the symbol had become. Apple pie was not chosen because it was uniquely American in origin. It was chosen because it felt American through use. It had been repeated until it seemed ancient. It had been baked by enough families, sold in enough restaurants, praised in enough newspapers, and remembered by enough soldiers that its foreign ancestry no longer mattered. The pie had been naturalized. This is where propaganda and genuine feeling braided together. Wartime governments, advertisers, and newspapers leaned hard on domestic imagery because it worked. Posters and campaigns often used home, family, kitchen, and food to explain sacrifice. Grow a victory garden, save fats, stretch sugar, accept rationing, send food to troops, buy bonds, do without, so the boys can come home. Apple pie sat inside that emotional economy, even when wartime rationing made sugar, butter, and other ingredients harder to obtain. That shortage did not weaken the symbol. In some ways, it strengthened it. A scarce pie could become more precious. A remembered pie could become more perfect than any real one. War turns ordinary comforts into holy objects. A slice of pie became a promise. You can come back, you can sit down, you can eat this again. The world you knew is waiting. Of course. The world waiting at home was not equal for everyone. Black Americans served in segregated units during the Second World War, fought for a country that denied them full rights, and returned to discrimination in housing, employment, voting, education, and public accommodations. Japanese Americans were incarcerated by their own government during the war, their homes and businesses disrupted or lost. Indigenous servicemen returned to a nation that still controlled and often exploited native land and sovereignty. Women worked in factories and military support roles, then were pressured back toward domestic ideals when the war ended. So when apple pie symbolized America, the question remained, whose America for many people? The pie represented belonging for others. It represented a promise the country had not kept. That tension never disappeared. It simply sat beneath the crust. After the Second World War, apple pie entered the booming world of post-war abundance. Suburbs spread. Refrigerators became common. Supermarkets expanded. Diners flourished. Frozen foods grew. Advertising wrapped family life in images of clean kitchens, smiling mothers, obedient children, and reliable brands. The pie became part of that landscape. It appeared in print ads, recipe pamphlets, school cafeterias, roadside restaurants, and holiday spreads. It became wholesome by repetition. But remember what industrialization had already done. Apple pie could now be made from standardized flour, refined sugar, commercial shortening, canned filling, frozen crusts, or factory-made whole pies. The symbol of homemade comfort increasingly existed in a world of mass production. That was not a contradiction Americans rejected. They embraced it. A factory could make nostalgia. A diner could sell memory. A supermarket could freeze tradition in a foil pan. And somehow, the symbol survived. Maybe because apple pie had always been assembled from contradictions. Foreign and local, humble and luxurious, domestic and imperial, handmade and commercial, ordinary and ceremonial. It had practice holding opposites together. By the middle of the 20th century, apple pie was no longer just something Americans ate. It was something Americans meant. It could stand for soldiers, mothers, small towns, freedom, comfort, patriotism, and a version of innocence the country desperately wanted to believe in. The phrase that would seal that meaning was coming. Simple, rhythmic, almost too perfect, as American as apple pie. As American as apple pie sounds ancient. That is part of its power. It feels like something a farmer might have said while leaning against a fence in 1776, or something a grandmother might have stitched into a sampler beside a little blue house and a red barn. It sounds older than radio, older than diners, older than supermarkets, older than the country's own habit of turning comfort into advertising. But the phrase is much younger than the feeling behind it. Apple pie had been eaten in America for centuries, but the exact wording as American as apple pie appears to have gained real strength in the 20th century, especially around the years after the First World War, and then more forcefully through the middle of the century. That is an important distinction. The food was old in American life. The slogan was newer. The dessert came first. The patriotic catchphrase came later. That is often how tradition works. First people do something. Then they do it often. Then they forget when they started, then someone gives it a phrase, then the phrase pretends it was there all along. By the time the phrase became widely recognizable, the United States had changed dramatically. It was no longer a loose coastal republic of farms, ports, and small towns. It was an industrial giant, an immigrant nation, a military power, a consumer society. and a country deeply anxious about what held it together. Millions of people had arrived from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, China, Mexico, the Caribbean, and many other places. Cities had swelled, factories had grown, languages mixed in streets and schools. Old Protestant rural America no longer had the country to itself, even if it often behaved as though it did in that world. Apple pie offered a kind of edible consensus. It did not require you to explain the Constitution. It did not ask you to agree on tariffs, immigration quotas, labor unions, race, religion, or foreign policy. It simply sat there, fragrant and familiar, saying America could be imagined as a kitchen rather than a battlefield of identities. That was comforting. It was also selective, because the pie chosen to represent America was not tamales, not gumbo, not chow mein, not black-eyed peas, not fry bread, not matzo ball soup, not spaghetti with red sauce, not jerk chicken, not tortillas, not rice and beans, not any of the countless foods actually eaten by Americans. Apple pie became the symbol, partly because it fit the dominant story the country wanted to tell about itself. Rural, white-coded, English-speaking, domestic, Protestant in mood even when not in doctrine, sweet, orderly, and safe. That does not make the pie fake. It makes the symbol political. Symbols always choose. They include and exclude at the same time. Still, apple pie proved flexible. Immigrant families adopted it, adapted it, bought it, baked it, served it, and sometimes used it as a way of entering American custom. A child of immigrants might learn apple pie in school, see it in cafeterias, taste it at a neighbor's house, or watch a parent bake it from a magazine recipe with careful attention. Food can be assimilation, but it can also be play. A family can make the national dish and still season life in its own language. This was not always a tragic surrender. Sometimes it was simply dessert. The rise of diners gave apple pie another stage. The American diner became one of the 20th century's great democratic eating rooms. At least in mythology, a counter, a stool, coffee refilled from a glass pot, a server calling out orders, chrome, vinyl, pie cases, and fluorescent light. The diner could feed truck drivers, office clerks, students, night workers, families, policemen, salesmen, and travellers who wanted something predictable in an unfamiliar town. Apple pie belonged there beautifully. A slice could be served plain, warmed, with whipped cream, or à la mode, a phrase borrowed from French but made thoroughly American in practice when it came to pie with ice cream. There are competing local stories about the origin of pie à la mode, including claims connected to the late 19th century. But the broader point is easier to prove than any one legend. By the 20th century, warm apple pie with cold vanilla ice cream had become one of the country's most recognizable dessert pairings. Hot and cold, soft and crisp, tart and sweet. A small domestic drama on a plate. Supermarkets pushed the story further. By the mid-20th century, Americans increasingly shopped in large self-service grocery stores, buying branded flour, sugar, spices, shortening, canned fillings, refrigerated dough, and eventually frozen pies. The pie did not have to come from an orchard or even from a skilled hand. It could come from an aisle. And yet advertisements worked hard to make the aisle feel like home. This is the great trick of modern food culture. It sells convenience while promising tradition. It removes labour while praising homemade values. It tells you that a factory can help you become the kind of person your grandmother supposedly was, even if your grandmother herself would have had strong opinions about the texture of that crust. Probably very strong opinions. Frozen apple pies entered the American market as part of a wider revolution in frozen foods. Clarence Birdseye's work in quick freezing in the early 20th century helped transform how Americans thought about preserved food, and later, companies expanded frozen meals, vegetables, fruits, and desserts. The frozen pie fit perfectly into a post-war world of busy households, modern appliances, and advertising that promised women they could be efficient and loving at the same time. Notice the pressure in that promise. Be modern, be traditional, save time, prove love, use convenience, make it seem homemade. That is a lot to ask of one pie. The phrase "as American as apple pie" thrived in this environment because it could be used sincerely, commercially, jokingly, and politically. It appeared in newspapers, ads, speeches, popular culture, and everyday conversation. It could praise something wholesome. It could mock something over-patriotic. It could sell cars, appliances, insurance, restaurants, or actual pies. The phrase became so familiar that people could twist it and still be understood. That is when you know a symbol has won. It can survive parody, but underneath the slogan, the reality kept changing. By the late 20th century, fewer Americans baked pies regularly from scratch. More bought them from bakeries, diners, supermarkets, and fast food chains. More apples came from large commercial orchards. More varieties were chosen for storage, appearance, shipping, and consumer expectations. Apple pie still meant homemade even when it was increasingly not made at home. That contradiction did not weaken the symbol. It may have strengthened it, because nostalgia often grows stronger when the thing it remembers becomes rarer. The less often people roll pastry themselves, the more powerful the image of rolling pastry becomes, the less connected people are to orchards, the more magical the orchard seems, the more industrial the food system becomes, the more fiercely people cling to a dessert that appears to deny industry. The pie becomes a portal. Through it, people imagine a simpler America. The farmhouse, the grandmother, the windowsill, the county fair, the soldier coming home, the diner at midnight, the holiday table. Some of those memories are real, some are inherited, some are invented, most are mixed. That is not a flaw in the symbol. That is how symbols breathe. So by the end of the 20th century, apple pie had completed one of the strangest journeys in food history. It had gone from Central Asian wild fruit to Roman orchard crop, from medieval English pie to colonial cider economy, from settler food to wartime emblem, from homemade labour to factory product, from recipe to slogan. And now, to understand the pie in your world, you have to leave the slogan and enter the modern orchard, where apples are no longer scattered seedlings on a rough frontier, but polished, sorted, cooled, sprayed, branded, stored, shipped, and sold through one of the most sophisticated fruit industries on earth. The modern apple looks simple because the modern apple industry has worked very hard to make it look simple. You see the fruit under bright supermarket lights, stacked in careful pyramids, each apple polished into near sameness. Red, green, yellow, blush pink, a tiny sticker, a price by the pound. maybe a wooden crate display in autumn, designed to make you think of farm stands even when the apples have passed through warehouses, grading lines, refrigerated trucks, and distribution systems more complex than anything John Chapman could have imagined. The apple has become natural-looking industrial perfection. That is not an insult, it is reality. Modern apple production depends on breeding, grafting, irrigation, pesticides, pruning systems, migrant labour, cold storage, controlled atmosphere rooms, global shipping, brand licensing, consumer testing, and an almost obsessive pursuit of the apple that can do everything. It must look beautiful, it must resist bruising, it must store well, it must travel thousands of miles, it must taste sweet enough for modern palates, crisp enough to snap between the teeth, and reliable enough that a shopper in February can expect something close to the apple she bought in October. That kind of apple does not simply happen, it is engineered by agriculture. In the United States, Washington State became the giant of apple production. Its dry climate, irrigation systems, volcanic soils, long sunny days, and cool nights made parts of the Columbia Basin and Yakima Valley remarkably suited to apples. By the 20th century, Washington was producing a dominant share of the nation's commercial apple crop, and it remains the country's leading apple state. When many Americans picture the modern apple industry, even if they do not know it, they are often picturing Washington. Not the old East Coast seedling orchard, not the cider nursery, rows of trained trees under big western sky. There is a reason those orchards look different from old farm orchards. Modern commercial growers often use dwarfing rootstocks, trellis systems, and high-density plantings, instead of enormous old trees that require ladders and patience. Many new orchards are designed for efficiency. Smaller trees can bear fruit sooner. Pickers can move faster. Pruning can be more controlled. Sunlight can reach the fruit more evenly. Machines can assist in parts of the work, though harvesting fresh apples still depends heavily on human hands. And those hands matter. The apple industry has long relied on migrant and seasonal farm workers, including many workers from Mexico and Latin America. They prune in cold months, thin fruit, repair trellises, move bins, and harvest under pressure when fruit is ready. Apple picking is skilled physical labor. A picker must move quickly without bruising fruit, climb or work platforms, carry heavy bags, judge ripeness, and repeat the motion for hours. The orchard may look peaceful from a road. Inside the workday, it can mean heat, dust, ladder strain, aching shoulders, pesticide concerns, unstable employment, and housing that has too often failed the people who make the harvest possible. The supermarket apple hides labor as effectively as the old pie hid empire. Different century, similar habit. By the time apples reach the packing house, they enter another world entirely. They are washed, brushed, sorted, sized, graded, photographed, scanned, and separated according to color, diameter, defects, sugar levels, and market destination. A tiny bruise can change value. A shape that tastes perfectly good may fail visually. Fruit that does not meet fresh market standards may go to juice, sauce, animal feed, cider, or processing. The modern apple is judged before you ever judge it. That is why supermarket apples can feel so uniform. Uniformity is not nature. Uniformity is sorting. Then comes one of the least romantic and most important parts of the modern apple story. Controlled atmosphere storage. Apples continue to breathe after harvest. They consume oxygen and release carbon dioxide, Left alone, they ripen, soften, and decay. Controlled atmosphere storage slows that process by lowering oxygen, adjusting carbon dioxide, controlling temperature, and managing humidity. In the right conditions, some apples harvested in autumn can be stored for months, then sold long after the orchard has gone bare. Think about that the next time you bite into a crisp apple in spring. You may not be eating a fresh-picked fruit in the old seasonal sense. You may be eating October. Paused by cold rooms, chemistry, sealed doors, sensors, and an industry designed to make time itself less visible. This is not necessarily sinister. It reduces waste. It stabilizes supply. It allows growers to sell over a longer season and consumers to buy apples year-round. But it changes the relationship between fruit and time. For most of history, apples helped people endure winter because they stored better than many fruits. In the modern world, technology has stretched that ancient advantage almost beyond recognition. The apple was always good at waiting. Now we have taught it to wait professionally. Meanwhile, the number of apple varieties available to most shoppers has narrowed and widened at the same time. That sounds contradictory. Because it is. Genetic diversity across historical apple varieties is vast, with thousands of named cultivars developed over centuries. Yet for much of the 20th century, supermarket shelves were dominated by a relatively small cast of commercially useful apples, especially Red Delicious, Golden Delicious, Macintosh, Granny Smith, Rome, and later Gala and Fuji. Red Delicious is the great cautionary tale once admired for flavour. It was gradually selected for colour, shape, durability, and visual drama until many consumers came to associate it with thick skin, soft flesh, and disappointment. It looked like the idea of an apple. For a long time, that was enough. Then consumers rebelled quietly by buying other apples. The rise of varieties such as Gala, Fuji, Braeburn, Pink Lady, and especially Honeycrisp changed expectations. Honeycrisp, developed by the University of Minnesota and released in the 1990s, became famous for its explosive crunch, juicy texture, and high price. It proved that consumers would pay more for a better eating experience. Suddenly, breeding programs and commercial growers had a new model. Flavor could be branded, texture could be intellectual property, an apple could be marketed almost like a smartphone. Cosmic Crisp, a Washington-bred variety released commercially in the 21st century, shows where the industry has gone. Years of breeding, large promotional campaigns, managed production, a name designed for memory, a promise of sweetness, acidity, crunch, and storage quality. This is not just fruit, it is product development growing on trees. A far cry from a seedling beside a frontier river, global production adds still another layer. China is by far the world's largest apple producer, growing tens of millions of tons annually. The United States, Turkey, Poland, India, Iran, Italy, and other countries also play major roles in production, fresh consumption, processing, and exports. Apples move through international markets as fresh fruit, juice concentrate, dried slices, puree, cider, vinegar, and flavoring. Your apple pie may taste local, but modern apple economics is planetary. And pie apples are not always the apples people snack on. Bakers often want firmness, acidity, aroma, and the ability to hold shape under heat. Granny Smith, Northern Spy, Jonathan, Rome, Braeburn, Golden Delicious, and many regional favourites have all had their champions. A perfect eating apple can become mush in a pie. A sharp apple that seems too aggressive raw can become magnificent once baked with sugar, butter, spice, and thyme. The pie still knows things the supermarket forgets. It knows that acidity matters. It knows that texture matters. It knows that not every apple needs to be shiny. Still, the corporate orchard has changed the symbolic apple. The fruit that once represented homestead permanence now also represents global agribusiness. It is grown through contracts, patents, managed varieties, packing facilities, labour systems, university breeding programs, and consumer data. It is both ancient and modern, both natural and designed, both humble and intensely managed, and apple pie sits at the end of that chain, pretending nothing complicated happened. A pie can still be made with apples from a backyard tree, rough, spotted, fragrant, and irregular. It can also be made with apples bred for international markets, stored for months, shipped across countries, and bought under fluorescent light in a plastic produce bag. Both pies may taste like home. Both may be real. That is the strange survival of apple pie. It absorbs change and keeps its emotional shape. The orchard became corporate. The apple became branded. The market became global. The pie remained familiar. But America was never the only place that baked apples into comfort. And once, apple pie became a symbol of the United States. The rest of the world could look back at that symbol with curiosity, affection, imitation, skepticism, and sometimes a raised eyebrow. Because apple pie may be American now, but baked apples have always belonged to many kitchens. Once apple pie became American, it did not stop being global. That is the funny part. The United States wrapped the dessert in patriotism so thoroughly that people sometimes forget how many other countries have their own apple pastries, apple cakes, apple tarts, apple dumplings, apple pancakes, and apple-filled comforts. America did not invent the longing for warm apples and pastry. It simply gave one version of that longing a flag. Across Europe, apples have been folded into dough for centuries. In Austria and the old Habsburg lands, apple strudel became one of the great apple desserts of Central Europe, made from thin, stretched dough wrapped around apples, raisins, breadcrumbs, sugar, and cinnamon. A good strudel dough is stretched so thin that people often say you should be able to read through it. Whether every cook ever achieved that is another matter. But the idea tells you what the dessert values: delicacy, elasticity, skill. Different from American apple pie, not lesser, different. In France, apples appear in tarts that treat the fruit almost like architecture. Thin slices arranged in circles. Butter, sugar, pastry, glaze, restraint. The tarte tatin. Often linked to the Tatin sisters in the late 19th century, is one of the more famous examples. The popular story says the upside-down caramelized apple tart came from a kitchen accident at their hotel in La Motte-Beuvron. Like many charming food origin stories, the details are difficult to pin down completely, but the dessert itself is not in doubt. Apples cooked in butter and sugar beneath pastry, then turned over into a glossy amber crown. That is not farmhouse America, that is caramelized French drama. In Britain, where the American pie tradition partly began, apple pie remains deeply familiar, but it carries different associations. It may appear with custard, cream, or cheddar in some traditions. It belongs to puddings, school meals, Sunday lunches, and family tables without needing to symbolize the entire nation. Britain does not generally need apple pie to prove it is British. It has other edible arguments for that, some more persuasive than others. In the Netherlands, apple tart is tall, spiced, often enriched with raisins, sometimes flavoured with lemon, and served in generous wedges. In Sweden, äppelkaka may be more cake-like or crumbly, depending on region and family. In Germany, apple cake and apple pastries take many forms, from rustic sheet cakes to delicate layered desserts. In Poland, szalotka brings apples into cake and pastry traditions with its own texture and memory. In Ireland, apple cakes and tarts fit into a long rural baking culture shaped by butter, flour, fruit, and thrift. One fruit, many homes, that matters, because America's claim on apple pie is emotional rather than literal. The dessert became American not by exclusive invention, but by symbolic adoption. Other countries could bake apples beautifully and still not call the result national destiny. The United States did. That is the difference. It also meant that apple pie became something foreigners could use to understand America, or make fun of it, or sell it back to itself. By the 20th century, American culture travelled through soldiers, movies, television, fast food, music, advertising, tourism, and global trade. Apple pie travelled with that image. It appeared as shorthand for small-town innocence, suburban comfort, diners, baseball, Thanksgiving, 4th of July cookouts, and the friendly excess of American desserts. To some observers, it seemed warm and sincere. To others, it seemed sentimental, commercial, and a little too pleased with itself. Both reactions make sense, because American apple pie is not only a recipe, it is performance. It performs home. It performs continuity. It performs a version of America in which conflict can be cooled, sliced, and served with ice cream. That performance became especially visible through fast food. McDonald's introduced its apple pie in the 1960s, and for many people around the world. A small handheld apple pie from an American chain became one of their most direct encounters with the dessert. It was not a farmhouse pie. It was portable, standardized, hot, sweet, cheap, and wrapped in paper. Earlier versions were fried in many markets, later baked in the United States, with recipes adapted over time and across countries. A global corporation had taken a national symbol and turned it into a pocket. There is something almost perfect about that. The McDonald's apple pie does not replace homemade pie, but it reveals what the symbol can survive. It can survive refrigeration. It can survive freezing. It can survive foil pans. It can survive drive-through windows. It can survive being eaten in a car with one hand while trying not to burn your tongue on molten filling. And yes, that filling can be dangerously hot. Small warning from history and common sense. Apple pie also travels through holidays, especially Thanksgiving. Even though pumpkin pie often dominates the older holiday imagination, apple pie fits Thanksgiving because it carries harvest, abundance, and family without requiring much explanation. It also appears on the 4th of July, where its patriotic meaning becomes even more obvious. A dessert with a global ingredient list becomes part of celebrating national independence. History does enjoy irony. Outside the United States, American-style apple pie can function as culinary costume. Restaurants may serve it as part of an American menu alongside burgers, fries, milkshakes, barbecue ribs, pancakes, or fried chicken. Sometimes it is lovingly made, sometimes it is exaggerated, sometimes it is too sweet, too thick, too cinnamon heavy, or served with a scoop of ice cream large enough to qualify as a separate weather system. The point is not accuracy. The point is recognizability. Food symbols do not travel as precise recipes. They travel as impressions, the smell of cinnamon, the lattice crust, the phrase à la mode, the diner slice, the grandmother image, the flag napkin, the idea that this dessert somehow explains a country of more than 300 million people. It does not, of course. No single food can explain a country that large, that diverse, that contradictory. Apple pie cannot explain the United States any more than tea can explain Britain. Rice can explain China, or baguettes can explain France. But foods can provide entrances. They let you ask better questions. Who grew this? Who sold it? Who cooked it? Who claimed it? Who was left out of the story? Why did this taste become memory? Ask those questions, and apple pie becomes useful again, not as propaganda. As evidence, in modern America, apple pie now competes with countless desserts and identities: cheesecake, brownies, chocolate chip cookies, pecan pie, sweet potato pie, tres leches cake, flan, mochi donuts, halo, baklava, gulab jamun, and so many more sit inside American food culture. The country's dessert table is far wider than any patriotic slogan admits. Yet apple pie remains strangely durable. It is still invoked in politics, advertising, comedy, holidays, and nostalgia. It still appears in diners and freezers. It still wins blue ribbons. It still makes people argue about crust, spices, apple varieties, cheese, ice cream, and whether raisins belong anywhere near it. For the record, that last argument can ruin a perfectly peaceful family gathering. And maybe that is why the pie endures. It is specific enough to feel familiar and flexible enough to absorb difference. You can make it deep dish or shallow, latticed or plain, with butter crust or shortening crust, with tart apples, sweet apples, mixed apples, dried apples, cider reduction, cheddar, caramel, crumble topping, or no nonsense at all. Each version can claim authenticity because apple pie has never had only one true form. The symbol says America. The recipe says argument. That is very American. By the 21st century, apple pie had travelled so far from its Central Asian origins that it could appear almost anywhere as an instantly recognizable sign. A bakery in Tokyo can make it. A cafe in London can reinterpret it. A chain restaurant in Dubai can sell it. A home cook in Toronto can bake it for Thanksgiving in October. A grandmother in Ohio can insist hers is the real one. A frozen factory pie can cross a distribution network with more precision than medieval spice merchants ever dreamed of. And still, when the filling bubbles through the crust and the smell fills a room, the old trick works. The world gets smaller. Kazakhstan, Rome, England, the Caribbean, Massachusetts, Ohio, Washington State, and the global supermarket all collapse into one warm dish. Not because the pie is simple, but because the senses are powerful enough to make complexity feel intimate. That is what America claimed, not just a dessert, a way to make history smell like home. And now the story's ready to close where every food history eventually closes. Not in an empire, not in a factory, not in a slogan, but with you, standing in an ordinary kitchen, looking at something so familiar that it almost disappears. And so the story returns to the table, not the royal table of Richard II's cooks, with saffron glowing through a fruit mixture sweetened by figs and raisins. Not the Roman villa where orchard knowledge moved through empire, not the frontier clearing where seedling trees stood as proof of settlement, not the plantation kitchen where sweetness came wrapped in coercion, not the factory line, the rail depot, the diner counter, the frozen food aisle, or the polished supermarket display, your table. That is where the whole strange journey ends, because food history only becomes real when it reaches the hand. A fork breaks through crust, steam rises, the apples have softened but not vanished. Cinnamon and nutmeg move upward before taste arrives. The filling clings together, glossy and warm. Maybe there is ice cream melting into the edge. Maybe there is sharp cheddar beside it, because some traditions insist on making dessert slightly confrontational. Maybe the crust is homemade and uneven. Maybe it came from a freezer. Maybe the pie was baked by someone you love. Maybe you bought it on the way over and carefully removed the price sticker. Either way, it carries more than it admits. That is the quiet trick of apple pie. It looks humble, but its history is almost absurdly large. It begins with wild apples in the mountain forests of Central Asia, in what is now Kazakhstan, where bears, horses, deer, and humans helped spread a fruit full of genetic surprise. Every seed was a gamble. Every sweet tree was a discovery. Every successful graft was a small act of human cleverness that turned chance into continuity. The first lesson was patience. An apple tree does not reward hurry. It asks for seasons. It asks for waiting. It asks someone to believe the future is worth planting. Then the apple moved west. It entered Persian gardens where enclosed spaces, water, shade, and fruit could suggest paradise itself. It entered Greek and Roman worlds, where grafting, pruning, estate agriculture, roads, and trade turned orchards into part of civilization's machinery. Rome did not simply eat apples. Rome organized them, named them, classified them, spread them. The empire broke apart. But trees have a way of ignoring political collapse. They kept producing. Then came medieval England, where pastry formed the shell that would eventually hold the American imagination. The earliest English apple pies were not the simple cinnamon sugar desserts you may know. They could include apples, pears, figs, raisins, and saffron. They were fragrant, expensive, practical, and strange. Their crusts were sometimes containers more than delicacies. Their sweetness came before cheap sugar. Their spices carried trade routes inside them. Then empire deepened the flavor. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, mace, and sugar entered European kitchens through dangerous, violent, profitable worlds of trade and conquest. The warm scent now associated with comfort was tied to ships, monopolies, island seizures, enslaved labor, and plantation heat. The Banda Islands suffered for nutmeg. The Caribbean suffered for sugar. Millions of Africans were forced across the Atlantic. Millions, sweetness became ordinary because cruelty became organized. Remember that. A dessert can be comforting and still have a history that should unsettle you. Then apple pie crossed the Atlantic with European settlers, and the fruit entered North American soil. But America was not empty. Indigenous nations had already shaped the land through farming, burning, hunting, gathering, and stewardship. The settler orchard became food, drink, memory, and claim. A row of apple trees could mean permanence to one family and dispossession to another. It could mean cider in a barrel, vinegar in a cellar, land improvement on a document, and a future planted into someone else's homeland. Then came Cider America. Before the pie became patriotic, the apple became practical. Hard cider filled taverns, farmhouses, and barrels. Seedling orchards created thousands of local varieties, some crisp, some sour. Some fit mostly beer pressing, drying, or feeding animals. The apple was not yet a polished supermarket product. It was unruly, useful, democratic in its variety, even when the society around it was anything but democratic in its laws. Then came John Chapman, remembered as Johnny Appleseed, the gentle wanderer of schoolroom myth and the real nurseryman of a violent frontier. He planted seeds, sold saplings, carried Swedenborgian religious ideas, lived simply, and helped spread orchards across parts of the expanding United States. The myth made him harmless. The history makes him human, kind, eccentric, practical, and entangled with land hunger. Then the Republic gave the pie meaning. In early American households, apple pie became tied to domestic virtue, women's labor, thrift, hospitality, and national self-imagination. It was not invented in America, but it became American through repetition. Grandmothers made it, mothers made it, taverns sold it, cookbooks printed it, fairs judged it, soldiers missed it, immigrants learned it, advertisers polished it, diners served it by the slice. It was there when the young republic tried to imagine itself virtuous. It was there when settlers pushed west. It was there when enslaved cooks worked in plantation kitchens. It was there when industrial mills whitened flour and refineries cheapened sugar. It was there when cast iron stoves made baking more controllable. It was there when railroads connected orchards to cities. It was there when canned fruit, commercial shortening, branded flour, frozen crusts, and supermarket pies changed what homemade could mean. It was there when soldiers went to war and wanted to come home. It was there when mum and apple pie became a shorthand for everything supposedly worth defending. It was there when the phrase as American as apple pie rose into common speech. Sounding ancient even though its rise belonged strongly to the modern age. It was there when post-war suburbs, diners, freezers, fast food counters, and television ads turned domestic memory into mass culture. It was there when Washington state orchards grew into a corporate fruit empire of dwarf trees, irrigation, migrant labor, controlled atmosphere storage, branded varieties, scanners, packing houses, and refrigerated trucks. It was there when Honeycrisp and Cosmic Crisp showed that an apple could be bred, licensed, marketed, and desired like a luxury product. It was there when a fruit from Kazakhstan became a global commodity and an American emblem at the same time. It was there in Austria as strudel, in France as tarte tatin, in the Netherlands as apple tart, in Britain with custard, in diners with coffee, in fast food wrappers, in freezers, in church basements, in state fairs, in kitchens where people still argue, with unreasonable intensity, about crust, and now it is there in front of you. A dessert so familiar that it seems simple, which is exactly why it's worth studying. Apple pie is not just apple pie. It is migration, grafting, empire, domestic labor, slavery, settlement, memory, marketing, industry, nostalgia, and the human habit of turning complicated histories into something warm enough to eat. So the next time you see a slice of apple pie, do not let its sweetness fool you into thinking it is small. It has crossed mountains, oceans, plantations, battlefields, railroads, orchards, factories, diners, and family tables to get here. Not bad for a dessert America did not invent. If this story surprised you, do me a favor and hit subscribe, like the video. And tell me in the comments which part of apple pie's history you did not see coming. There are many more ordinary foods with extraordinary pasts, and I will see you in the next one. Sleep well.